So for the second session of our day today is with Nicola. You'll see Nicola has moved to my office upstairs in the house, and she'll be doing her paper from there. After Nicola's paper, we'll ask all of those who are in the room who've had a chapter in the book to come in and just to have a chat really about the issues that have come up through the book about social mobility and so on and so forth. But Nicola, over to you now.
I would just like to thank the organisers and to thank Margaret and Terence Crongshaw for that fantastic introduction. They really, it's humbling when they've presented my achievements in such, I'm really humbled by that introduction. Thank you very much, Goats. So it really is. So going from being upstaged by a goat to feeding the horses, which has been my take on the modern slavery storyline. And what I, so just sort of a spoiler, just in case, there'll be some people on this call for whom this is completely new analysis. There are some people for whom I did present my early thinking on this paper in the Saturday group. It was really helpful in terms of sharpening up some of the terminology. There is both a blog and a podcast out there. I'll put the links in the chat. And also it's been taken up with some of the media coverage for the conference. So when Charlotte Higgins wrote her lovely introduction the other day, she focused on the neoliberal necropolitics angle. And when I've been doing some media work this week, people do seem to find it funny that it's the sort of most obscure or kind of difficult kind of corner of social theory. So if you are the kind of person that upon encountering concepts, particularly things which are slightly more philosophical, I will recommend the podcast and the blog as a start, some of the journalism, and then obviously you've all got in front of you a month before publication date, the excellent Flapjacks and Feudalism, that says Nicola's copy at the top, Social Mobility and Class and the Archers. And actually, this was a little bit of a late entry, to be honest. Thank you, everybody. You can wave your books. Everybody, show us your books. It was a bit of a late entry because this book, as you will know, if you look at the contents, some of the, in fact, I was reflecting on, so Claire Astbury's housing papers from the British Library, some of them are from Sheffield, some of them from Reading. So it does span everyone that's done political economy work or economy work applied to the village over the last few years. And I got to tell you, everybody, I mean, I know that this is all a bit, Saturday group is marvellous, isn't everything marvellous, aren't goats marvellous? But I'm really proud of this book. I think it's really important and I think it really says something. And I think also it sort of represents us hitting our stride in terms of, the pieces are very disparate, they're different, they bring different sort of analyses, and but that is good, as we always say, there's a real diversity of voices in here and different topics, and there's absolutely nothing about, and it's back to what Karen was saying, there's no line in academic archers. There's not even that we all hate Schuler. I mean, some people love Schuler. The point is that, it really shows a sort of disparate set of voices, but all concerned with, as I say, the political economy that underpins life in Ambridge, from housing to work. And we realised quite late in the editing process that we had the modern slavery storyline not covered, which would have been just an egregious omission, given that we've struggled through it for 3 or 4 years. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read a bit from the chapter, and then, as I say, we'll ask any authors who want to speak about their themes for a bit, and then that will consider the book officially launched. You've got one in your delegate boxes, but you can't buy it online anywhere else until the 16th of March. Dark Jackanory with Nicola Headlam. Thank you, Cara Courage from downstairs. Right. Feeding the Horses, Modern Slavery, the Dark Side of Construction, Hidden in Plain Sight in Ambridge. The chapter explores, this is page 57 in your textbooks if you want to read along, everybody. I was looking forward to saying that. I haven't said that for a long time. The chapter explores how the recent storyline about modern slavery has landed in Ambridge, commending the writers and producers for the job they've done in engaging NGOs and pressure groups active in this area. It situates the plight of the horses as hidden in plain sight and probes the dark side of this important social issue in the context of how far the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people provides a ground floor within a profoundly unequal economy. Modern slavery speaks of a wider form of neoliberal necropolitics, in which logics of accumulation and hierarchies are played out on the bodies of workers. In this form of political economy, social and emotional vulnerability and economic precarity combine together, trapping those unable to escape exploitation. It explores the policy context for the Modern Slavery Act and an assessment of how many people are enslaved in the UK. I also make the link from the extreme nature of modern slavery and connections with extractive and abusive employment situations throughout the economy. While modern slavery is an extreme form of precarity, where people are controlled and forced to work, scholarship on precarity as a phenomenon shows us it's a spectrum disorder, where economic abandonment pushes people away from a livable life. And essentially, if there's anything that I would like you to remember from this talk, it is that economic abandonment, let's go start again. Precarity, as in being economically precarious, a situation in which up to 20% of the British population exists at any one time. And one of the benchmarks is, could you survive if you weren't paid for 3 months? I mean, how many households could survive without the paycheck for 3 whole months? Could you survive if you weren't paid for 1 month? How long would you survive, before you start to need somebody to intervene, Ambridge Fairy or otherwise? So precarity then is a spectrum disorder where economic abandonment pushes people away from a livable life. Now, the more I got into all of this, and I mean, you're going to think I'm completely bonkers, or you know I am. I've been reading more and more philosophy on the notion of life, of bare life, of whatever life. Because also, I think that there's been a sort of moving away from a kind of a rights-based discourse around people have a right to work, a right to housing, and a right to, I mean, I'm not going to say right to life because that's got a specific, pre-birth context. And I'm not interested in when life starts. I'm interested in how some people are grievable and some aren't. So Judith Butler, the amazing theorist, in her book, The Theory of Nonviolence, which actually I saw her deliver some of the lectures for in San Fran, which Cora reminds me was 5 or 6 years ago. You can look at that in the Archers, right? So the notion of grievability. In Bridge Farm, their eldest son died. And as a result, we've got echoes for 30 years of that kind of trauma, delayed and deferred, and how far it's messed them all up, essentially. The loss of their kind of golden boy, their kind of heir, can be seen all the time in Tom and Helen and Pat and Tony, right? So Tom Archer, not Tom, John Archer, sorry, got confused, and of course the lovely Johnny appearing. John Archer was grievable. He had status. He had a kind of life mapped out. If you compare that with Blake, Kenzie, and Jordan, these boys are not grievable in the same way. They don't have the notion of their precarity. They're not being ripped out of the bosom of a family and treated terribly. I think there's a real thing when once you get into talking about modern slavery, is that it isn't like, they just walked out of the front door of a fabulous loving home one day and were like, boom, I want to be a slave. There was awful lot of junction points and jumping off points where different things could have happened to them that would have made them less vulnerable. And, to be fair, that could have been one good interaction with a support worker or one housing officer. That's, the point is that for people that are more precarious, the snakes and ladders board of life has got a lot more snakes than ladders in it. So we had a bit of a storm in the Facebook group around people asking, well, he did feed and house them. Maybe there is some kind of monetary kind of, maybe if we calculated that, then that would have been kind of an equivalent thing. And I have to say that I've got a lot of kind of time for the writers have really muddied the waters on this story, right? They haven't made it clear exactly what exchange relationship went on, and because Philip believes that anything that he's done wrong is better than how they would have fared on the streets, that they've deliberately led us to really question what are the moral edges of who is grievable and who isn't. Why do we allow some people to really struggle and others we cosset and put a blanket around, metaphorically? And again, those of you who've seen me talk before, I've done the work that I've done on the networks of the village and the ways in which the Aldridges and the Archers are infinitely connected into the kind of web of entitlement and horrors. But that's a different paper for another day. The point is that when networks fail, that's when you start to have people that have got a very long way to fall. And on the wrong day, Philip pulling up in his car with a happy meal and some nice words, as Gavin said on Thursday night, it makes you think how little you have to do for somebody who really is extremely, somebody who is rough sleeping is at risk. I mean, not only are they likely to have a lifespan of about 35, they are at risk of every kind of exploitation, and they're already presumably by the time you're starting to house people who've been rough sleeping for any length of time, you're dealing with drug and alcohol, sex work, sexual trauma, and as Karen said, identity is intersectionally constructed, and more or less for Blake, Kenzie and Jordan, they've got intersections there compounded of disadvantage. So we know that if they're not learning disabled, they certainly maybe they don't have sort of literacy. They weren't able to put their life experience into context and think of the difference between Linda Snell. If the direction of a road doesn't quite meet her needs, she's got all that cultural capital to deploy in getting what she wants, whereas those lads were grateful to Philip on some level. I mean, I do have some slides for this talk, but I didn't think I would use them because we'll be slided out. But the relationship between the master-slave dialectic is right at the core of philosophy, and it's been kind of a question from as soon as we're trying to work out what are the conditions and the rights that one has as a member of a society, then you start to work out who is beyond that notion of care. And I had a picture of a teddy bear with a heart saying, the master-slave dialectic is not a simple thing, because from Hegel onwards, the reciprocity between power and authority and those who wield it and those who are subject to it has been a question, a very vexed question. I'm seeing Mia stroking her head, so I'll get on and read some more things. So in the chapter, which is to say you can explore, I started to read, so I commend to you the work of Achille Mbembe, the post-colonial theorist. He's written a brilliant blog about the pandemic, which I really recommend, which is called The Right to Breathe. And again, just as I was starting to think about a rights-based discourse, he has applied it to the ways in which the pandemic has been resolved or whatever. And as I said, that's very easily, I'll send you the link, it's very easily Googleable. So Mbembe is a good place to start. But I'll just read this. This is section 5, page 66 in your books, everybody. Modern slavery is an extreme form of precarity, where people are controlled and forced to work. Scholarship on precarity shows it's a spectrum disorder, where economic abandonment pushes people away from a livable life. Remember that line? That's the line I want you to remember. As we reach for descriptors on intensified social marginalisation, the concept of precarity has come to name the politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks, becoming differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. And that's from Judith Butler. Precarity has its roots in good old-fashioned economic exploitation. How far are Fagan's pickpockets different from Blake, Kenzie, and Jordan? And is further weaponized by the prevailing necropolitics of late capitalism. And if I was writing this now, in the pandemic, this is accelerated even further, where some populations are made more grievable than others. Life, then, is not valued for itself within the global circuits of exchange or stretched supply chains of the present moment. There is little equivalence between the lives of the consumers, voters, and taxpayers within established democracies and the others, more marginal souls, economic migrants, the trafficked, the unfree, sweatshop workers, the precariously housed, and those wholly reliant on others. Within contemporary debates, the nature of bare life, so life without any of the accoutrement of consumption, voting, tax paying, all that kind of stuff, and the cultural politics of disposability. At times, this logic produces apathy toward the suffering of others, as if they somehow deserve it, and dislodges responsibilities to care from broader social, political, and economic institutions. In others, it produces forms of liberal empathy in which those with wealth and privilege engage in forms of humanitarianism. Examining the way precarity is created and sustained and how it is lived doesn't mean that you look for what's exceptional on the margin, but you have to understand how those who are thrown into precarious circumstances might find ways to live otherwise. And I go on, Henry Giroux, Eugene Thacker. Gosh, Eugene Thacker is a fabulously depressing read. I'm not sure I would recommend it at the moment. What I would like to discuss just before, where are we for time? I've been going for like half a week. Fine. Okay, I'm winding up. Table 4.1, 69 in your books. Gosh, this is so fun to be able to say this. Now, again, I want to address this issue of how far we all, the horses storyline has been to appall us about the nature of modern slavery, that people could be so dehumanized, traded, and exchanged. But what I'm trying to do in this table, and I would like some discussion around, is that, okay, let's look then at other forms of low pay housing and social standing in Ambridge, right? We start off with the horses. Are they paid the minimum wage? They are not. Is their housing and shelter tied or contingent on their work? Well, yes. What do you mean you need an update for Rex? He's bloody well there. Turn the page. Ha ha. Sorry. The type of employment, and then the esteem, and this is the fascinating one, because again, remember the Bourdieu notion of economic capital underpins kind of what one can expect out of life, but the interrelationship between economic, social, and cultural capital give you the example, the way that those things combine, lock in advantage or disadvantage. So whilst we can see the horses are in the worst of positions in terms of their minimum wage, their housing, their employment, and their esteem, because they are abused and threatened with violence, let us read down the worked examples. The home farm fruit pickers. So arguably, we know that they were treated pretty well and given barbecues, etc., and they were contracted for summer harvest. The worst thing that happened was some casual racism and some resentment. The work is physically demanding and the conditions weren't exactly snazzy, but we felt that they were paid a premium by the Aldridges to do that piece of work when it needed doing. William, when he was the gamekeeper, we assume his contract with Borchester Land did pay him the minimum wage, but I would be surprised if it was much more, because he had a tied cottage with the tenancy. So tied housing, I mean, we all know the story of clergy and others who have tied housing but at very low wages. You know, you live at the old vicarage, but you're struggling to pay the electricity bill. And that was stable and long-term employment. But obviously, at the point at which he was no longer employed, he lost his house. I mean, that was part of why the Grundys closed ranks around him, being more or less, you know, homicidal, kill me. Now, this is the key, you see. As the gamekeeper in a rural economy, you are a highly respected ingredient of the rural land management economy, right? That's the esteem. Same as clergy, you know, they are viewed as, well, arguably, they are viewed as a high status profession. So that the difference between William the gamekeeper in his tied housing and the fruit pickers in accommodation on site is really only how far we respect the labour of fruit picking or of gamekeeping. Arguably, fruit picking is even more integral to the rural land management, but let's not even go there. I was being chided in the chat. Rex drives an Uber-style minicab. They've never called it Uber, but some of you were having to pay excess last night when you're getting back from the pub, I heard, you know, after all that. So, you know, poor Rex having to mop out the back of his Uber. Uber, as we all know, is piecework. So you get paid for every route that you take, that you drop people on. And there are quite high standards around your car needs to be in XYZ condition. It needs to be, you know, the back needs to be carpeted and all that malarkey. It has to be clean. And a lot of Uber drivers are in a contractual tied relationship with Uber for buying their cars. So I don't know if you've ever seen it, comes up on the app, UberX. Now, if you drive a clapped out Ford Cortina, you're quite easily able to get finance through Uber. One of Uber's main jobs is as vehicle finance houses. They don't have their own fleet, but you can get a low interest loan to buy a Mercedes or whatever to get that premium. And this is the kind of core of what we have what has come to be known, certainly in pre-pandemic times, as the gig economy. Because obviously the idea that, you know, like if you work in opera, like Bill and Sarah, you know, if you're making decisions about having a violinist, that person needs to be absolutely the top of their game. They might get quite a lot for one assignment, but they have to be kind of fit and ready to go with repertoire and kit and travel and transport and go now. And, you know, supporting that life is extremely hard. So you're only paid for the gig. That's why they call it the gig economy. Now, Rex is pretty ashamed of this. He's quite ashamed of his portfolio career because he can't sustain himself through farming. So he is quite, I mean, he gets out and does it, but he's certainly, I mean, there was that something weird bit, wasn't there, where he suddenly got very angry about the archers are going to inherit the earth and I'm not. And the bottom line is, most of the younger people in Ambridge are unable to secure their housing through their employment. And without the Ambridge Ferry and Claire Astbury's brilliant housing analysis, you know, that's not something that's incredibly sustainable. The last example that we've got is Emma at the turkey factory. She'd be getting the minimum wage, but not much more. But of course, the turkey factory it was her third job at the time, and she couldn't, doing 3 jobs, cover the housing costs that would have been reasonable for a family of the size that she had. And again, that was a source of shame, that she needed to supplement her income, and the actual labour itself was unpleasant, cold and nasty. So I put it to you that it isn't that the horses are in a horrific exploited corner of the economy, but everybody else is fine. It's quite the contrary. The spectrum disorder point is that insofar as we have discourses around housing and labour which do not foreground rights, then the pool of those who are precarious will continue to grow. And arguably, the net that supports and sustains a livable life, a grievable life, a meaningful life, weakens. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. There is some really, really rich commentary in the chat here. at all sorts of different levels. It's really hard to summarize, but there were some people, I think, in particular that had some really interesting things to say. So Kiki O'Neill, I wonder, would you be okay to unmute yourself and talk a little bit about what you said from your experience as a practitioner?
Yes, thanks, Cara. I've been really struck by the modern slavery story, and I see somebody else has posted that it's really been of interest nationally because it affects white British people. But I'm very interested in general in the concept of othering people, not just to do with slavery, but to do with how we conduct our lives. And working on the margins, as I do, I work in forensic psychiatry, so people I work with have committed fairly serious offences and have very serious illnesses, but they're multiply disadvantaged. And I can't think of any one of, perhaps two of my patients in the last 17 years who would not have been vulnerable to being picked up by an apparently benevolent employer, because they're so desperately precarious in their lives. And also sometimes because of their illness and substance misuse issues, their judgment will be impaired at times. So they will trust people who are manifestly not trustworthy, and they're able to reflect on that when they get well. But it does, I think, I've reflected on this a lot over the decades, I do think that it all starts when we can other another human being. And as soon as we do that, when they're not like us, somehow their currency is less important. And I think it's a very dangerous phenomenon. Just my view.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So I don't know if people want to come in or if we want to just have a look. As I say, this is the I mean, that is kind of the distinction that Judith Butler about the grievable and non-grievable. But what I found, once you start to list out the non-grievable, it's so long, right? There's so many ways that you can become ungrievable. There's so many ways that you can not matter. And again, these are hard things to kind of tease the kind of moral position on, because, as I say, the tentacles of precarity reach into the hearts and the homes and the jobs of so many people, and the pandemic has really only served to accelerate those trends. So in my day job, I'm working on how far the economy is looking K-shaped. So, you know, most of the stimulus measures have been in the realm of capital, and then the real economy itself, there's going to be far more precarity. The spectrum disorder is going to have more people more vulnerable in the recovery period. Some people will never recover, and that's true of any any crisis whatsoever. It ends up so the virus hits at the point of multiple intersectional inequalities and does its work there. So, you know, it is no surprise that it's differentially, spatially, economically, culturally, socially derived, and so the differential effect on different communities, and it is because we have stretched those hierarchies to breaking point that's because our society's kind of love for inequality and our seeming inability to provide the basics for everybody literally has made us vulnerable to death.
Can I, Marilyn Mornington has also spoken about this in the chat as well. So Marilyn, also, if you're happy to, could you unmute yourself and say a little bit about your working experience of this situation at the moment?
I'll unmute myself because I've still got my rollers in. You can't see me till this afternoon.
Fair enough.
Yeah, yes, I mean, I've been 45 years a judge and, well, 30 years a judge, 45 years a family lawyer. And I'm still sitting because we are so inundated. 2 or 3 days a week. And in my entire experience, and basically I've specialised my whole life in national and international domestic violence, I have never seen anything like it. The number of cases that we have and the sheer severity of them, and the horror of the level of violence that women are experiencing. And it has so massively increased in lockdown. And again, I've sort of pointed out that all my career, right until the current day, I am so appalled that so many, and I'm using carefully the word professionals, expect, in particular, working class women or women from certain communities to accept horrendous behaviour and have these men in their lives, whether it's for contact, for the children, whatever, and to continue to be abused both physically and emotionally in a way that they would never, ever expect middle class women or their own families to expect. And that continues to the current day, that attitude that, well, it's what happens in these communities, it's what they've always done. I remember a very long time ago, a very nice elderly judge saying to me, Marilyn, I don't know why you bother with this business. These women only say they've been abused to get the house, and that's just the way these people live. Now, he spoke it openly with nobody criticizing him, but unspokenly it's still continuing to this day.
Well, I mean, to be honest, though, they shouldn't have vaginas. That's their first mistake. I mean, ridiculous. They deserve what they get. If they actually have lady parts, then sorry, I'm joking. Obviously, I take the point, and I feel there is a connection, though, to the political economy of the funding of services. So one of the things that I've always had in my head is, if public services are only for the poor, then they become poor public services. Yeah. And I feel that the COVID crisis is only the C in the ABC: austerity, Brexit, COVID. And you're absolutely right, like, it's like the sort of test is for all of us, in whatever sort of public service role we are, is the test of exactly, would you advise your sister, your friend, to use this service to get where they need to get? And the answer in too many cases is, oh, no, the service is designed for other, and the assumption, and you're absolutely right, the assumptions that underpin what one is supposed to tolerate and what one is supposed to accept are again, and misogyny, racism, all the intersectional kind of boogeymen pile on top of people at the worst times in their lives. And I know that family court is where a lot of that happens. Thank you very much for your.
And just to finish it, the idea that the courts, you keep on seeing in the press that the courts are in decline because of COVID, is an absolute lie. The courts have been deprived of funding.
Absolutely.
30% a year cuts year in, year out for 10 years. That's why we're falling to pieces, as so many other public services are. End of rant. Back to the fun.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I do feel like I'm sort of, as I say, I've been banished to Cara's office. I've suddenly got into this ridiculously hardcore stuff, and it's a very long way from the goats. So I'm sorry to sort of, it's basically my, this is my dark kind of, I've the necropolitical framework, there's no laughs in it, it's bleak as hell. But I just think if you don't have a way to frame that inequality is played out on the body and the consequence is death, then you can't understand. You can be sort of neoliberal, you can be a kind of business as usual political economy, sort of small c conservative, without having the death cult overtones that we've seen in the pandemic. It's possible, right? But when you combine neoliberalization as a set of processes and a necropolitical attitude under which you've already written off a lot of people as not mattering, you are in a mess, because it's not all souls are valued. It is, you're in a transactional relationship where some lives are not valuable. And and again, I'm going to get back out of all the philosophy, guys. It really is too much for Saturday morning. So the point is that the Archers has been incredibly brave, I think, in doing this, because, who wants to think about extreme precarity as part of their kind of entertainment? I mean, those of us who've looked into the heart of forms of exploitation and precarity, you're wounded and forever changed by that experience. Talk about a community of practice. If you take your life seriously as somebody that needs to understand and do no harm and just improve things a tiny bit on your way through this world, whether that's faith-based or not, but if you want to be a good person, you cannot ignore that this is the foundation of our prosperity. Like, how can you ignore that? And all this stuff about the village and how guilty they all feel, how, Philip went around in a Father Christmas jumper offering mates rates to everybody, and everybody felt that they were getting a bit of a deal and a bit of a bargain. They didn't ask if he paid minimum wage. They didn't check. And again, this isn't about Philip. As I say, it's much more about the wider structural point. But to bring it to us in a way that we can understand it and then act on it, it's a really important thing. And as you all know, we have Hope for Justice as our charity this year, and a proportion of the ticket price and will go to their work, because they are actively freeing people from those situations in reality. And that is very, very important work. And as I say, I'm sorry to kind of bring the mood down. What I wanted to, if anybody, so, you've got the book a whole month before publication. So what I was thinking was, maybe if people want to speak to specific chapters, we could maybe prevail on the generosity of the Saturday group and have some chapter readings and stuff, because this is as I say, I think for me, this is kind of where it all comes together, because as social justice is very, very important to me, as is the notion that everyone you meet knows something you don't. So, with that in mind, coming together to talk about things that, even when they are extremely difficult, I think it really can be about a very powerful thing about academic archers. So I will leave it there, because what does it say on I haven't got my program with me.
We're going to take a break at 12:15, and it's just coming up to 12 now. So we've got around a quarter of an hour, where we could invite, those who've got a chapter in the book, please do, come forward. But I think, the chat has talked in such a wide way, starting from your talk around, basically coming from modern slavery, that it has talked about social mobility and class. There's a lot of comment here. So I think if there's the authors in the room, absolutely, but do also unmute yourself if you want to share what you've said as well, because there's such depth in this. It's almost impossible. I don't know where to start, actually. There's so much coming through from people. There is always that awkward thing on Zoom when somebody speaks first and then somebody jumps in as well, but we'll just have to get through that. But if any of the authors in the space want to have a chat first, and then we can open up a bit wider too.
And just to be clear, so the authors are The Grundys and Their Oppressors by Keith Flett. I've got a second chapter. If You Have Security Ed, That's Everything, Deconstructing Security as a Buffer Against Life Challenges by Lalage Campbell. Borsetshire Businessman or Feckless Farmer by Christine Narramore. What to Do When You're No Longer Borsetshire's Business Person of the Year, or How to Handle a Scandal by Olivia Van Dyke. Contemporary Social Problems in a Rural Setting, Using the Archers in Social Work Education by Helen M. Burrows. Academic Archers Assembly, Putting the Parents on Trial by Cara Courage. Accent and Identity in Ambridge, the link between how we speak and who we are. We should have called him Damien. A discussion on the impact of Henry Archer's early years. Fear, Fecklessness and Flapjacks, Imagining Ambridge's Offenders by Charlotte Bilby. Rich Relatives or Ambridge Fairy, Patronage and Expectation in Ambridge Housing Pathways by Claire Astbury. Woo! Staying in the Spare Room, Social Connectedness and Household Co-Residence in the Archers by Paula Fomby. Can't Afford the Laurels, Care Provision in Ambridge in 2045 by Heilbronn and Janssen. Parents, Siblings and the Pursuit of Power, Predicting the Future Leaders of Ambridge by Timothy Versalotti, Professor. From the moment those two joined the committee, it's been grunge bags, sumo wrestlers and souffles. What does Ambridge's civil society say about UK politics? And A Divided Village, a narrative study using a theoretical lens of speculative ontology. I'd buy that book, wouldn't you? That sounds bloody great to me. Claire, come on, say something about housing.
Yeah, I think it's your point that you make in your table about the precarity of housing. Housing is the main usually the main cost to a household. And particularly for low-income households, it's very much the main cost of a household. So the precarity of housing is one of the really key sort of elements of precarity in any marginalised people, I think. And we've obviously, my chapter's got a whole pathway around Emma Grundy, which explains the precarity. But your table's really useful in that shows how that do you earn enough in your main normal hours job to actually secure the housing you need is such a fundamental question, into which the answer is no for very, very many people. And the solutions around that, and at the British Library I talked about the retreat of the state and the fact that there is a bit of state buffering around that, but that state buffering is very significantly different now to what it was 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. That that it's piecemeal and patchy and inconsistent and not enough, and that leaves people very precarious. So at the situation where, and it's quite hard to talk about this in a way that doesn't make Philip look like a good guy, which is not what I'm intending, but the idea that he saw a previous apprentice who was living rough, and then he said, well, look, I can't afford to pay you, but I'll put you up in a flat. And the what's the package value of that? Actually, somebody who's on minimum wage would struggle to afford to live in a flat, even or in a shared flat, or if they're on benefits. So that space between benefit levels and minimum wages and precarious and fluctuating work means that a lot of those people who live like that will have possibly less security, certainly of housing. I'm not saying that it's all right because they're slaves. That's not right. But actually, that thing alone, as long as they're in that tied employment, they are more secure in their housing than lots of other people who are being paid and not slaves. So our dependence on our employer for a roof above our heads is, again, another continuum where people sit in lots of different places around precarity and exploitation. And I think your stuff really draws that out so well. And I think, the interaction between housing, income and options is, really fundamental to life as well, because I'm a housing person, so I make it all about housing. But, without that, so much else falls apart. So it's interesting to see how that fits together. But it's not very cheerful, I'll be honest.
Bless you. Well, thank you very much for that. Are there any other authors on the line who would like to say something? They can change the tone slightly. I mean, just for what it's worth, I mean, that, the fact that our benefit system supports low pay, it exists. That's what it exists to do, because through working family tax credits, you're supporting employers to not pay people minimum wages, which were put in as a public policy solution to low pay. So the relationship between, and again, low pay, housing, and the esteem in which one is held. And once you've abandoned a rights-based framework, then you really are lost. Amy, you want to come in, pet?
Well, yes, I think it's really interesting, this notion of precarity. And I don't know if those of you that will remember me from last year may or may not remember that I was talking about the different spheres that civil society exists in Ambridge. Now, down on one side, there was the social sphere, but the other side was the political sphere of whether we can stand up and campaign when we've got issues of precarity. Now, one of the worrying things that I pointed to last year, and I said, I don't know if this is an indication of the way that things are going, but that whole sphere of of actually campaigning in a contested way in the public sphere seems to be absent from Ambridge at the moment. Now, is that something to worry about? And I think that's really interesting when you consider how precarity is on the rise at the moment, and when you think about the kind of things that are being discussed politically as well. So at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the National Trust were doing something wrong when they talked about slavery, and there's been some criticism of the National Trust getting involved in the political sphere. So I think that actually there's a link there between your paper, Nicola, and mine, in that whole question of whether or not it's okay within the civil society, whether in Ambridge or in real life, but of course Ambridge is real life, and yes, to the question of whether or not we still have the ability to stand up and fight against precarity, which I think has been eroded.
I think that's right. And I think that certainly notions of solidarity, I mean, that's the point, that's the reason that when the Independent did the trailer for this, and they were like, boffins get together to discuss neoliberal necropolitics, my back goes straight up, because they're saying, I think that by giving these things a name, you begin that process. But insofar as you don't have the words to discuss them, then how can we how can we say what we don't, and modern slavery is so pernicious and so part of our, I mean, in fact, let me just, in the chapter, the thing at the beginning says, to remember, because they were built, because they made the decision for them not to be in the farming supply chain, which is quite an interesting one. I'd quite like to hear from Kerry about that. So by making them builders, right? And I've got the chunk at the front of the chapter, and it does speak to what you're talking about, Amy. It says, construction is a bipolar industry. On the public side, we create inspirational buildings, pushing the boundaries of architecture and technology and solving ever more difficult challenge. The dark side, the systematic exploitation of millions of vulnerable workers, is rarely acknowledged, even by the clients and multinationals that commission and create our shiny new cities. The sector is rife with human rights abuses, bonded labour, delayed wages, abysmal working and living conditions, withholding of passports and limitations of movement to all forms of modern slavery. The business models must take a large part of the blame. The global trend towards outsourcing and cut price contracting makes it easy for main contractors to duck out of their responsibilities, arguably, right? These stretched supply chains, which are a key part of the outsourcing and neoliberalization playbook, and they make it invisible, right? They deliberately render obscure these exploitations. So the plight of the most vulnerable gets lost among the long and complex supply chains. And you're right, but the first step towards being able to, God forbid, mobilize, all these old words that we've forgotten, have solidarity, work together, organize, but because it's so pernicious, it's like how, those things people have where they've got their cellar is full of so much damp the house could all fall down. My feeling now is that precarity serves to threaten the whole fabric of our political economy in a way that, and I just have never understood how, in economic and political and social terms, people are perfectly happy to have the benefits of capitalism, but the externalities and the disbenefits and the partial nature of prosperity is something that some people are able to push out of sight. And I just don't see how that's in terms of your mental capacity to understand your life, how is that sustainable now with 20% of Brits in this situation? So yes, thank you for reminding us that there is a political, and as I say, a rights-based discourse, I guess, is pointing towards a political solution. I'm not there in terms of I don't know that you can mobilize behind the neoliberal necropolitical. As I say, it makes people laugh in the press or whatever. But the point is, you can't fight what you can't discuss. You can't be what you can't see, all that stuff. And without a language to describe these relationships between poverty, wages, insufficient housing, precarity of employment, precarity of esteem, then we really are nowhere. And sorry, I've gone off again on a run, haven't I? Anybody else want to come in? That is a really good point.
Yeah, it is a really good point. Helen Burrows, I'm not sort of asking you necessarily to defend Kirsty, but would you be happy to speak to what you've just put in the chat about how this session has made you rethink Kirsty's actions at the moment?
Yeah, if I can talk sort of any reasonably. It's just made me think that actually she is standing up for her principles, and she's actually putting herself at a huge risk. She could end up in prison with contempt of court, but as it is, she's practically homeless now anyway. If the house is taken as proceeds of crime, where's she going to go? You know, she has started again several times. She had to start again after Tom jilted her, but she is in a position of extreme precarity, and she's principled enough to be pushing herself further to do that. And I just think there's been a lot of criticism of her, and I think, you know, what she's doing isn't legally a very good idea at the moment because of the issues of contempt of court, but bloody hell, you've got to admire her for it a bit.
I don't know. I mean, I think, again, like the downside to a structural approach, it does lead you reevaluate everybody's motives, right? Because if this, you know, if the risk of precarity is kind of the big, you know, bogeyman that we've all got to avoid at all costs, which is what keeps us from mobilizing for change, right? Then you have to look at human agency in a different light, right? And again, this is where this can become incredibly dark, because how much choice. So Kirsty exercised some economic choices by settling for a man who was, you know, solvent and had his own teeth, but wasn't exactly, you know, she was settling. So she did deals inside herself to be like, he might not be everything, but oh, go on then. And she chose security. And this is why Lalage's paper is so good. And a lot of people make decisions about their lives not based on Hallmark cards, whether or not she did it on purpose. But for her to be faffing about doing a voluntary job that wouldn't cover her rent and bills was an example of using her privilege. And that's why she feels terrible now, because she was able to faff about with the ducks rather than get a roof over her own head. And for me, what the thing that you raise, and I think that, again, I don't mean to be annoying about this, you know, I'll go on about the characters all day and all night and their kind of foibles, but within the kind of jaws of neoliberal necropolitical kind of structural explanations, how much freedom does how much freedom do women have? Which makes securing your economic right to exist as a woman your most important. Nobody can take it from you if it's yours. You don't have to compromise who you let through your front door, who you have in your bed, you know, who's the father of your kids, if you own your own front door. And I'm sorry if this is ridiculously outdated thinking, but I think it is the major, and you'll know I'm not, I know, I get it, Jackie. The point is that what are the range of options that we have? She says Kirsty did what many women do. I'm not saying that she's any unique in that, but again, let's surface this, right? Everyone deserves to be safe, and everybody deserves to be able to have the life that they want, not be compromising, not be settling, not be talking themselves into it, not be, you know, it's, and there is still something in there about the status, you know, women and property. You know, I would always say, you know, get your happy place and build out from there. You know, it's you can, and again, gentlemen, apologize. I just think I apologize in advance for what I'm about to say. I think being dependent on another human, a man, for example, for your security is the basis of not being free in your own head. And then from that point onwards, women are far more precarious in general than men are, because for reasons that were mentioned by the brilliant judge, etc., they have to deal with the consequences of male violence and of sexual violence and of children, all of which are things which are the kind of dirty that don't wash clean, right? Sorry, I'm really, this is, you know.
It's okay, Nicola. I'd like to come back to Karen Pollock, if that's okay, Karen. Wake up from your knitting. You said there in your last comment around us, you know, or the projection, Kirsty's projection, you know, sort of solving her guilt. But I've also wondered in this, and this goes back to your previous paper, about how us as listeners have projected, or in that transference, about our quite difficult or ambivalent moral position in this storyline. And we're up to time now, but perhaps if we could just close with that comment or your thoughts on that, Karen, and then go into the break with that. Thanks.
I think it's really complex, because it's both what you just said and what Nick said, because it's easier if we think that Kirsty has full and free choice and went into the relationship with Philip eyes wide open. And I think there's a lot of transference of our own not looking behind closed doors in that whole relationship. And the choice, it's a pyramid. Yes, she's white. Yes, she's cis. Yes, she has social capital.
She's physically able. She has social capital. She's educated to a degree.
But she's still a woman who was having to make underneath patriarchy. And I think we wanted to close the curtains and shut the door and go, oh, she'll be fine.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So
and I think, if I may, sorry, Cara, I'm just going to literally just close. The point about all this is, you just can't look away. You don't have to become a fully paid up member of anything, but we are all complicit in all this, and just don't look away is all I would say. And I know it's been a bit hardcore this morning, and I apologize for just, you know, the bleakness, but don't look away.
Thank you. And I've got to say that all of the comments in the chat here has just been they're just fantastic. And but you know, we're going to be also a lot of lived experience as well within this group too. We're going to break for tea now for another 15 minutes, and we'll be back for 12:30, and we've just got a session then 12:30 to 11:15, and then we'll be breaking for lunch. There's been a lot of people recommending different reading and blogs and things like that. So during the break, I'll go into the Facebook group and I'll start a thread that people can add those to that thread, as well as being in the chat. So there's just a little bit more sort of permanent place for them to sit. So we'll be back at just past 12:30. See you then.